Hello, everybody. Okay, so today we are talking about Dworkin Chapter 2. We will proceed as normal here. The plan is to talk about, uh, for me to raise a bunch of questions and for you to answer them, hopefully. Uh, so, let me make sure I got the picker wheel in position. We're probably going to use the picker wheel a little bit here today. Uh, all right. Frankie's asking pineapple on pizza. I love pineapple on pizza, by the way. I know it's very divisive, but I think it's great. Um, but I am from Idaho, so you know. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Uh, I have a number of questions for you today. Let's start off right at the beginning here of this chapter. So this chapter, hopefully you guys were following along. It's a fairly complex chapter. There's a lot of stuff going on in this chapter. Um, and hopefully I can clear up some of it as we proceed here. Let's go ahead and share this. There we go. And I'll put myself down here. By the way, I just noticed that this chair in the background keeps like appearing and disappearing. Hopefully, it's not too distracting. Uh, all right. So, I'm going to ask a question. I'm going to spin the picker wheel. We're going to try and get about five people on the picker wheel, and then I'm going to go just to whoever wants to volunteer. Some of the questions I'm going to ask might be a little bit difficult. Um, so, let's see. Um, let's start with something fairly simple. So, my question is, what's the point of the practice of taking one's hat off while one is in the presence of nobility? What is this supposed to express? So first, we'll spin the wheel. Yunma, are you here? Yeah, you are. Go ahead. What's the point of that practice?
Um, can I skip?
All right. Let's see.
Um,
Let's see who else we got here. What's the point of taking one's hat off? This is a common practice in medieval Europe. Liana, are you here? Let's see here. I don't think I got it. Okay, taking a note for Liana. All right. Did have a few hands though. Let's go to Harriet. Go ahead.
Um, I think it's a sign of respect. It's also like it's the same when you go into church. You're supposed to take your hat off so that I don't know if it's exactly for church, like to be closer to God, I guess, and to show your respect.
Hmm. Yeah, to show your respect. Yeah. And that's at least one interpretation of it, right? That it's supposed to be about the broad concept of showing one's respect for somebody else they're interacting with.
Hmm.
Yeah. Fatima, do you want to add to that?
I do know that it's a sign of respect, but it's also, I think the word's like humility, like it's a sign of like, it's like a sign of respect that this person has more authority over you, but you also acknowledging that you're kind of lesser than the other person.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. And I think that is especially an apt comparison for the medieval practice of it, where it was typically done by peasants toward the nobility, right? If you're kind of, yeah, Fatima is saying it's a sign of submission. Marcel is saying it has to do with social class and establishing power or of authority. Um, yeah, other Fatima is saying submission was the word you're looking for, not humility. Yeah, I think both of those fit though. Yeah, Michaela, you want to add?
I just wanted to say also, it's also based off of like traditional values as well. So like taking off the hat, is based off of that respect, the not humility. What did you guys just say? Submission. And just
Mhm.
saying that, hey, I am taking the account that I'm respecting the traditions already set in place, kind of thing. Because since everyone's doing it, it's already respected amongst. Well, it's supposed to be respected amongst others, but it's also like kind of reinforcing that everyone's doing it, so I'm gonna do it as well.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yeah. So you're kind of in conformity with other people. You stand out more if you don't do it. That might be one reason to do it. Yeah. All right. Last point on this. Go ahead, Umul.
Sorry, I think it might have been mentioned. I think you just said it. I think it's not a rule exactly. It's sort of an assumption, and you just follow through it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So you kind of have this assumption that this is a necessary practice. Yeah. Okay. So um, one thing you guys hopefully know is that you don't have to do this anymore. There aren't, at least in the United States, there aren't nobles that whenever you encounter them, you have to take your hat off when you're in front of them. And that's not just because you don't wear hats, probably, uh, but also because even if you were wearing a hat, it wouldn't occur to you to do it. Um, so a lot of us don't think that this practice has any value anymore, right? It's not a, it's not a, at least narrowly described, it's not a practice that we think is worth doing. It may have sort of progeny in the fact that if you go into church or something like that, you should take off your hat. But we don't have like nobility that we take off our hats habitually for anyway, anymore. So a lot of people have completely stopped caring about this practice. Um, and so it looks like this practice has evolved over time. Um, and let's see, what's the first question I want to ask about this evolution? So, uh, how is it possible that this practice has evolved? Like, what does Dworkin think about this? Because we used to do this, now we don't do it. How is it possible that it's changed? Yeah, Melissa, do you have an idea?
Yeah, so I think that he thinks it shows an example of how people like interpret social ways of society, social practices based on purpose. I
Hmm.
think he said it has like there's practice of value in it, and then there's practice of how it serves a purpose in society.
Okay. Yeah. So Hart's main way, or sorry, not Hart, Dworkin's main way of interpreting a social practice has to do with identifying what the point of the social practice was. Okay, that's good. So a key thing here is he's not. We might have just like a purely sociological explanation for why this happened. We might say that over time, social relations adjusted and changed to where there really wasn't a named nobility anymore, or even in places where there was, it's not something that is routinely done anymore. Um, and there might be a host of economic and social factors that lead to that. But Dworkin's interpretation here is kind of normative. What he's interested in is not just what are the social factors that cause this change, but what are the um, what are the uh, what are people's interpretation of the point of this change? Um, and so here he thinks we have to have a different we develop a kind of different interpretation of the point of the original social practice. Where before we might have thought that the purpose of it was to signal our submission or respect for our betters, over time we recognized or came to interpret this social practice as basically serving a broader goal. It was serving a kind of respect for other people you encounter in society. Um, and it may not have necessarily, it may be that our newer interpretation of this sees like the class relations of it as a kind of secondary thing that kind of was attached to the practice, but not necessary for the practice. So, um, so his idea basically is when we are identifying when we're interpreting any social practice, what we have to do is identify what the point of that social practice was. What did these people think they were accomplishing when they were doing this? And it may turn out that as society evolves and changes, we have a different understanding of the point of the practice. And some aspects of the practice may entirely fall out of fashion or use because they are anachronistic to our current understanding of what the point of the practice was. So over time, we got this broader conception of these kinds of greeting behaviors that was sort of divorced from the class implications that they may have originally contained. All right, so Dworkin's got this idea of constructive interpretation. Let's talk about that for a second. So he asks, what does it mean to interpret a social practice? And one answer is that we're trying to interpret what the people mean who established the practice in the first place. So let me just ask, and here I'll spin the wheel. Suppose this was our view of what interpretation was. It's like, well, what were these people trying to do at that time? How did they interpret it? What would that look like in the context of law? Like, what view of law would that be? Let's see. Catherine, any idea? What do you think? Not hearing anything from you, Catherine?
I'm not 100% sure, but if I were to guess, it's maybe they're looking looking for a way that it fits both the legal history and presents the legal system in the best like moral light.
Well, let's hold on. Let me like make this a little more concrete for you, because I think the question I asked is a little bit too abstract. So take like Brown versus Board of Education, for example, where the court basically said, hey, we have to end segregation because it is contrary to the 14th Amendment. And remember, there were a lot of people at the time who criticized the court saying, look, when they framed the 14th Amendment back in the 1860s, they were aware of segregation, and they did not interpret the 14th Amendment as implying that segregation should end. And so who are you now to decide that the 14th Amendment means that segregation should end? Shouldn't we just be interpreting it based on what people thought at the time? Like, so if they thought that, right, what's sort of, when we're trying to notice, like that looks a lot like this kind of version of interpretation that Dworkin is criticizing here, right? Felicity, you want to add?
Yeah, so in the context of like what you said, Brown versus Board, I think in the context of law, he sees it as judges interpreting laws that makes the legal system the most fair or the most justified.
Okay. Yeah, so they're interpreting it in a way that makes it seem like it's the most fair. So there's a bunch of ways of interpreting that, right? One view might be like a kind of like natural law view, like the kind of view that Hart was criticizing a few weeks ago, where like, look, we have this notion of fairness that's kind of built into the universe or given to us by God. And if this set of social relations that that is segregation is contrary to that basic notion of fairness that's built into the universe or given to us by God, then it must be wrong, right? Now, one thing I want to note is that's not what Dworkin is saying, right? He's going to have a somewhat different view here. Can anybody guess like what Dworkin would say to these critics of the Brown versus Board of Education decision? Like, they would say, look, they didn't have the framers of the 14th Amendment didn't have ending segregation in mind. So like, how can you say the 14th Amendment means, how can you interpret the 14th Amendment to mean that segregation should end? Shouldn't we just be talking about these original guys and what they thought? What would Dworkin say? Yeah, Yunma?
I think he would say that the critics would be wrong because the case was like a moral interpretation and they
Hmm.
wanted to equally protect those who it was against.
So there is a sense in which it has to do with morality, right? In that sometimes some of the things we are trying to accomplish with the law have a kind of independent moral foundation, and we're trying to use the law for some moral purpose. I think that's right. Although there's a broader conception here, and one thing I want to caution against is I saw this a bit in you guys' responses to your quiz questions for last week. Um, Dworkin is not simply saying that like law involves morality. Um, that is the case, but he thinks that there is a specific conception of what law is that is maybe partially moral, but not he's not just saying like law just is morality or morality is law. He's saying no, we can have a substantive disagreement about what law is, and it's not necessarily moral. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Um, yeah, but I think that's on to something, right? It's you're getting at the fact that Dworkin thinks there's a broader conception of what we're arguing for here that goes beyond what the initial framers may have thought, what their interpretation was. Fatima, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna answer your question about what you said, like Brown versus the Board of Education and
Mhm.
what Dworkin would say. So, on like when in the book on page 65, he talks about like stages of interpretation. So, like he would
Yeah.
say what he mentioned, the interpretive like phase where he would say like, oh, the 14th Amendment exists, like it's real, right? And then
Hmm.
he would say that like according to that amendment, like it's basically about like equality, right? So
Hmm.
according to that, like it should like segregation must be abolished.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Let's walk through these, right? Because I think it's good to bring up these different interpretive stages. So let's apply this to what they dealt with in Brown versus Board of Education. The idea was, the idea is, look, we're trying to interpret what the 14th Amendment says. That's what we're interpreting. So for Dworkin, what that means is we have to first identify the rules or the standards of the practice that we're trying to assess. The 14th Amendment has a particular text. It was written by particular people. Um, and what we have to do is first identify like what that text is and how it has been interpreted before. Then we have to settle on some general justification for it. Like, why do we accept the 14th Amendment and why did they pass it? What were they trying to do for it? What were they trying to do? And then we have to adjust our sense of what the practice really requires so as to better fit the justification provided. So, like you said, if the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to ensure a kind of social equality before the law, then then when we're interpreting what the 14th Amendment means, what it does, what its purpose is in our society, that interpretation cannot be exhausted simply by looking at what the original intention of the people who drafted it was. Because they may have had a certain conception of what social equality was at the time, right? And that conception may have been compatible with segregated schools. They may have seen no basic contradiction in saying, yeah, everybody should be equal before the law, and black people go to one school, white people go to another school at the time. But the thing they were trying to accomplish was a social equality before the law. What they failed to realize was that contradiction between social equality and segregation. So the goal, though, was this kind of social equality before the law. We recognize over time through our interpretation that that goal is not served by the other relevant social practices that they considered to be perfectly fine at the time. We now have more information. We now know that separate is not equal based on a lot of sociological information available to the court during the time that they passed Brown versus Board. And so we're adjusting our interpretation of the 14th Amendment to serve the broader goal that the 14th Amendment had. We're not constraining our interpretation based on that original conception that they had at the time. Marvin, do you want to add?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So I'm trying to make a connection to like almost like the nobility conversation we had earlier.
Hmm.
So is it basically like now we don't really tip our hats off? That's not something that we do as frequently. So is it the same to apply it to the Brown v. versus Board that like now when the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause was originally created, they had like a certain ideal, but it's almost like now we don't really tip our hats off. So now it's a whole new idea. So now we're like, okay, whoa. Now we have Brown v. versus Board of Ed. So it's like now we realize like how can we create an equal protection clause, but then like years later, we're not actually equal. Like, is it the same idea or not really?
Yeah, so let me draw the parallels here. So the idea is you have a set of social practices like tipping one's hat. And the equivalent to that in the context of the Brown v. Board case is segregation. So that's a social practice where we do certain things with certain people. People take certain kinds of actions in certain kinds of contexts. In one kind of practice, they are tipping their hats to their betters. In another, they're segregating white and black people. Then you have, according to Dworkin, you have the point of the social practice, what value we were trying to realize through the social practice at the time the social practice came into force. So the social practice, the purpose of tipping your hat to one's social betters, one interpretation of that purpose, and there are a bunch of possible interpretations, but one plausible interpretation was that you're trying to express your respect to people. That you respect them, and so because they deserve to be respected, you're tipping your hat. Well, the equivalent in the Brown versus Board of Education context is the value of social equality before the law. So here we have the purpose of the 14th Amendment, not just as instantiated by the social practices at the time, but the purpose, the thing they were trying to accomplish with the 14th Amendment was social equality before the law. Now, if we bring these practices up to the current time, we find that people don't tip their hats anymore because they express their respect for other people in other ways. The social practices have changed, but the underlying value remains the same. And in the same way, the social practices of the 19th century where segregation was okay, those need to change in order to fully realize the value that they were attempting to realize back in the 19th century that we're still trying to realize today, which is social equality before the law. So that's like, hopefully that gives you some kind of context for like what why he's bringing up this kind of social tipping your hat analogy, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So he's got other criticisms of this like narrow concept of interpretation that often gets deployed in the law. And we can see this in the context of like a lot of Supreme Court decisions today where the court is very conservative and they will either take an originalist perspective on what the Constitution says, which means like only interpret it in terms of what the framers thought at the time. Whatever their conception of what the law did is, that's what controls today. Or even more narrowly, whatever the literal words of the Constitution are, whatever those words meant at the time is what controls today, right? Even though there's this 250 years of history in between. He's got a bunch of criticisms of this mode of interpretation. Because a lot of conservatives on the court think that no, that just is what it is to interpret stuff. And if you're not interpreting it that way, you're just importing your own sort of activism or your own moral values to try and replace the original intent of the Constitution with your own stuff. You're masquerading as though you're interpreting the Constitution, but you're not. You're just making your own stuff up. Well, Dworkin thinks that's not what we're doing at all, right? You should see what Dworkin's doing in this book as providing a kind of a way of understanding how we might make sense of the concept of a living constitution. Okay, so let's talk about some of these examples he uses. So let's talk about this Shylock example. So this is a character in The Merchant of Venice, the Shakespeare play. Now, this character, as originally written by Shakespeare, has it's like subject to all kinds of anti-Semitic tropes. Like it deals in all kinds of anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish people being super crafty and only concerned with money and all this stuff, right? Why, if you were putting on a play today of The Merchant of Venice, why would you not just do it exactly as it's written on the page? Why would you not have Shylock look and act and say all the exact same things today? I mean, there's one really simple answer, which isn't the one that Dworkin likes. Felissa, go ahead.
So I think he says that you wouldn't because of the diverse audience we have today. Yeah, meaning that like the audience and the cultural context of the play from at that time are very different now, so they wouldn't collide together.
Okay, I think that's right. That's getting at an important part of it. But I want to be clear that Dworkin is not just saying like, look, it'd be pretty politically incorrect to put this play on without changes today. Because people would criticize if The Merchant of Venice was written today, people would look at that character and go, wow, this is a real like anti-Semitic boogeyman. It's a real one-dimensional portrayal of Jewish people. And it's pretty offensive for that reason. And so, yeah, a play probably wouldn't be financially successful. People wouldn't want to go see it if they found out like this is what this character is. Really, it's just this bald anti-Semitic trope. They wouldn't want to go see it. But Dworkin's making a deeper point about interpretation here too, right? So it's related to that, and I think you're getting close to it. But I want to make sure we're clear. Like, what's the problem with just here? Maybe I'll spin the wheel. My question is, what would Dworkin's problem be with just putting this play on exactly as Shakespeare wrote it? And it's not just that it's politically incorrect. Let's see. Is Jaylene here? I don't think so. Okay, let me make that note. Next person, let's see. Trina, do you have an idea? I saw your hand up earlier, by the way, not for this question, though.
Hey, I need some time to think about this, I think.
Sure, let's go to Omo. You've got an idea, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm right, but like I think like when someone is interpreting a play, it's basically like them taking whatever experience they had and then kind of just like using that as like a set intention towards like whatever they want to produce out of that play. So like if a person is really trying to kind of go back to like the way Shakespeare did it, like they really can't go into that sort of like state the author had. So like there is like no opportunity for you to be super original here.
Okay. I think there is some problems with just trying to interpret in the first place. Although I don't think that Dworkin is like a skeptic about our possibility of interpretation, about like he thinks that some interpretations are better than other ones. Um, so I think it's a point well taken that it would be hard to portray this. I think that's right. And hard to get at exactly what Shakespeare was trying to get at. Um, yeah, I think there's more though. Let's see. Daisy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on and say that one of the problems would be I think Dorkin kind of says that interpretation has to fit what society thinks is moral at the time. So putting on a play like this would kind of portray like you said, anti-Semitic stereotypes, which is not what society deems as like moral, like a moral principle. And I think Dworkin would say that the play needs to be interpreted by the audience carefully in that way. So putting on a play like that that highlights like injustice and prejudice would be like not morally right, if that makes sense.
Well, it might not be morally right. I think that's probably true. And it's also true that audiences interpreting a play probably should be careful, especially if it's a play written centuries ago. Um, I mean, and sometimes you ask the audience basically to be like, look, bracket your contemporary understanding, try and put yourself in the mindset of somebody who lived at this time. I think that's right. Yeah. Hold on. We got a little bit of commentary here. It's Yumna saying, Dworkin would want it to be the best version for today's audiences and give the play a better purpose. I think that's close too, or we're circling it. We're really close. Frankie, you're saying, wouldn't it be because of how we would interpret it through their acting? If you act the way how it was originally cast, you're choosing to interpret the character that way. Yeah. Okay. Here, let me like put this. We'll give Velissa a last shot at this, and then I'm going to tie this up in a bow. And all you guys are in the right area, right? You're very close. Go ahead, Velissa.
Yeah, I think I might just be picking back off of something somebody else already said, but it's just like him not seeing interpretation as copying what was originally done, and it's a practice of making the best version of something that's completely new. Yeah, so maybe something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, and that is I think you're hitting it from a different angle here, but a similar point to Yumna, which is like he wants to say that if you're interpreting the play today and putting on the play again is a kind of interpretation. What you're trying to do is identify what the purpose Shakespeare was trying to serve with the play was. So you're not just copying, and I think this is where this is correct. You're not just copying what Shakespeare was doing. You are trying to identify the purpose he was serving through these characters in the play. So what was the overall message of the play? What was what was it trying to convey? And you have to recognize that Shakespeare, when he wrote the play, had an audience in mind and had a purpose that he was trying to accomplish to these audiences at the time. Now, he was very different than we are today. His audiences were very different. But that doesn't mean that they were so different that there is nothing that we can learn from, or no way we can interpret what Shakespeare was doing or how his audiences interpreted it. Like, there were certain sort of artistic values or merits to the play that Shakespeare was trying to convey to his audience and that he expected his audience to interpret. We're trying to do the same thing when we put on a play today that is a Shakespeare play. The point is that the particular ways we instantiate those values in this play may be different, may necessarily be different than the ways they were instantiated in Shakespeare's time. So Shakespeare is going to draw on these anti-Semitic tropes in order to make these points that he wants to make, because his audience is full of anti-Semites who will require these kinds of tropes in order to really get what Shakespeare is saying. But the important thing when we're putting the play on is not to ape what he did in terms of like saying exactly the things he said and use all the same tropes he used so that we can perfectly recreate it. Doing that would miss the point of putting the play on. The point is to express the artistic values that Shakespeare was trying to express, and that may necessarily be done in a different way, using different vehicles within the play, different forms of character. Even different dialogue might be necessary in order to get it right. So here, again, if we were to draw this analogy back to the tip of your hat example, the specific instantiation of Shylock in Shakespeare's play is like the actual practice of tipping your hat. The things that Shakespeare was trying to convey with the character are similar to the things we are trying to convey with tipping our hats, which is we're trying to convey respect, or we're trying to convey these particular artistic themes or literary themes through the play. And the particular social instantiations of that, in fact, are not only not necessary for getting the interpretation right, but sometimes get in the way of that interpretation if mirrored too exactly and too literally, right? So again, think about this in the context of Brown v. Board. The way that they interpreted what social equality meant at the time and the actual social relations that they thought it justified were simply may not be the same as they are today. Oh, you came unmuted there, Trina. Did you want to add something?
Oh no, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about this. So hopefully you guys can track what I'm talking about there. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense, right? Because Dworkin and like other liberals on the court, people that have this view of the Constitution are criticized for just substituting their own view for what the Constitution actually says. And their response is, no, look at what the Constitution was trying to accomplish. It has in it certain values that it expresses. Those values don't adhere in the particular social practices that were prevalent at the time the different parts of the Constitution were written, either in the 19th century for the 14th Amendment or for the Bill of Rights back in the 17th or 18th century. Those social relations are a kind of accident. They're a result of social forces, which meant that this is how they tried to instantiate those values at the time. But for us to try and instantiate those values in our time requires different social relations, requires maybe ending segregation. If we look at it, like look at the Second Amendment, for example, what it meant to have the right to bear arms in the 18th century means something very different than what it means in terms of its contemporary social relations compared with now. Largely as a result of just like changes in society, changes in technology, right? The weapons we have today are so much more deadly and so much more efficient at killing people than they had back then. And so it may be that how they interpreted the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms is just the goal they were trying to accomplish, which was maybe freedom from government tyranny. The fact that the government had to be a little bit concerned that if it overstepped its bounds, an armed populace could put up a fight against it. That important view, that important value may be instantiated differently today than it was back then. It may not necessarily imply an individual right to bear arms, or it may, I don't know, it could be that the government is so much more dangerous now that we even need it more. I don't know, right? Let's see. Let me catch up to the chat. So, yeah. So he'd be a very good marketer in today's time with his plays. Yeah. Yeah. Bears don't even have arms. Okay. So let's talk about another reason why Dworkin thinks that this method of interpretation is wrong. And then there's a bunch of really complex stuff that I want to make sure we get to. So I'm only going to spend about 10 minutes on this, hopefully. So this has to do with ex post facto intention. Um, so Dworkin thinks that you can come up with people's that the intentions of works are not necessarily determined at the time the work was created. And here he's using this example of Fellini's film La Strada. So there's this character in Fellini's film which seems to be a reference to this ancient Greek legend of Philomela. Um, now, there's no evidence that Fellini was actually aware of this at the time. How is it, though, that you could legitimately say, according to Dworkin, that Fellini intended this character to be a reference to Philomena? To Philomela, yeah. So he wasn't aware of this character at the time. He wasn't aware of this Greek story. He made the movie. Later on, people pointed out, look, looks a lot like this character is inspired by this Greek story. And then Dworkin says, it's legitimate to say Fellini intended this. How's that possible? Philomena Kunk. I love that show, by the way. Yeah. How could he have intended this character to be a reference to this ancient Greek character when he wasn't aware of it? Let me spin the wheel. See if anybody's got a guess. This is a hard question. Marcella?
Professor, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, Fellini made this film. It's got this character. And he wasn't aware that the parallels between this character in his film and this ancient Greek story, this character from this ancient Greek story. Nevertheless, Dworkin thinks it's legit to say that that Fellini intended this character in his movie to be a reference to this ancient Greek story. How's that possible?
Can I pass on this one?
Yeah, that's all right.
Thank you.
All right, let's take one more spin and then we'll see if anybody's got a guess. Oh, now we're back to Trina again. I'm so sorry, Trina. Do you have a thought?
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yes. I would say, I mean, I have a question. So, if the filmmaker wasn't aware of the connection between the character and the Greek myth of Philomela, how
Yeah.
can Dworkin say the reference was intended rather than just saying that's something the interpreter is reading into the film afterward?
That's my question. How could he do
Okay.
that? Yeah.
Okay, so that's your question. Okay. Because that was my question too. Great. Awesome.
Okay.
I could say I'll take a jab at it.
Yeah.
I think in Dworkin's perspective, like something can count as the author's intention if it fits and it explains the work in a way consistent with the artist's purposes. That he probably thought like the artist's purposes for making this film was like, I mean, was intentional
Mhm.
and it somehow and it somehow explains that like how the work in a way is like consistent with the artist's intention.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Even if like even if the artist didn't like consciously think about that connection when creating it, it just like kind of flowed in so subconsciously.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been subconscious. It might be you just never heard of it. And Dworkin would think it's still okay to say he intended this or that this was a reference, right, to this ancient Greek character. Yeah, and it has to do with something about what the intention was, right? Yeah, and it's supposed to fit his purposes. Let's see. Neom had something to add to this. Go ahead.
No, I was sorry, I meant to lower it 'cause mine was similar to that, that like interpretation is not limited to someone's conscious thoughts in general. Like with this whole argument, I guess like your intentions sometimes are just like the best fit to explain certain things or like the works that are being created. Like it fits
Hmm.
like the work itself in this case and like makes it coherent along the lines of that. I don't really know how to explain it. Like this is a difficult question, but it was along the lines of the same thing.
Yeah, this is a hard one, but I think you're onto something here, right? He had intentions for what the work was supposed to accomplish, and he deployed this character uh, that in order to accomplish those intentions. And this character bears this resemblance, bears a kind of reference to this original Greek character. Um, and it's that it's not it's not that he had this in mind or that it came up subconsciously. It's that he was trying to do something with this film. And he was using this character to accomplish that thing. And it turns out that there's a kind of structural parallel in terms of what he's trying to accomplish with this character in this story and what the character in the Greek legend accomplished, what they were trying to accomplish with that character. And in that sense, it is a reference, whether he knew it or not. Uh, yeah. Let's see. I haven't heard from Oscar yet. Go ahead.
I think it's really because one came after the other. Like one of them, or like the Greek one was. It's fair to say that it's based off of it because it came first.
Hmm. Well, I think it might be necessary, but maybe not sufficient that it came first. It does feel weird to say that something that came earlier is a reference to something that came later. That seems kind of weird. Usually artistic references are references to something previous, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Because like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a necessary element. Yeah. Um, but I think like the kind of paradoxical notion here that the thing that people find confusing about this is just the fact that like, could this really have been a reference to this previous character if he wasn't even aware of it? Right. Um, and yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I think that's a necessary feature though. That's probably right. Uh, Fatima, go ahead. And then I'm going to close this part with a
Just
bow here.
for my own understanding. So, in short, it's just if the author didn't plan it, so long as like those parallels exist and the author accepts that those parallels exist and that they're kind of the same thing, it can be considered a reference, or does the author not have to accept it and say like, no, like this is different?
So I would say that according to Dworkin's view, uh, it does not even have to be something that that he himself would endorse. That like the author himself or herself would endorse. Um, so Dworkin's idea here is just like lawmakers trying to accomplish some purpose by passing a law and then implementing that law through a set of social relations. An author of an artistic work is it trying to accomplish something through that artistic work. Um, they deploy characters and plot devices and a bunch of other things and references and other things in order to accomplish that purpose. The things that so whether a character in a play or a movie or whatever, or a book is a reference to something else depends not on whether the author intended it to be a reference, but rather the purpose for which the author was deploying that character. So it could be that the author wasn't aware of it and would even disclaim that this was a purposeful reference at all after the fact. And yet it may still be a reference because the purpose that the character serves in the story the purpose in expressing whatever literary value this author intended um, is also served by this other character they were unaware of. So in this way, this is Dworkin pointing out that the authors of a text, and here we might remember we're talking about laws here. So the authors of a text, what's going on in their heads, at least as they what's going on in their heads, the only thing that matters is the value they were trying to realize. It does not matter how they tried to realize that value, because the value is the important thing. The way that they tried to realize it is a function of who they are, not what that thing is. So the framers of the 14th Amendment might have thought that segregation was perfectly consistent with social equality, but that whether they thought that or not is irrelevant. Because even if you took somebody from back then, you put them in a time machine and then brought them up to now, where we don't have segregation anymore, at least not de jure segregation, and then had them look around and say, like, hey, was this what you intended by the 14th Amendment? If they said, no, that's not what I intended, I thought that we would have segregated schools still. What Dworkin would say is, it's still the meaning of the 14th Amendment not to have segregated schools, because the way the author was trying to realize that intention, the way the author was trying to realize that value in their work, that's not as relevant as what the value is. So you can have ex post facto intentions. It's even right to say that they intended something that they didn't even realize they intended. Yeah. So it sounds tricky. It sounds almost like a sleight of hand, but the important thing is just identifying what Dworkin thinks is valuable here, which is the value expressed by whatever the author is expressing, or by whatever the author has intended to realize. That value is the important thing. The way they realize it can have a bunch of different instantiations that are relevant to different times, and that cannot be transposed between times in a lot of cases, because our society changes too much. And it's importantly, that doesn't mean that every interpretation of the 14th Amendment or of this Fellini film or of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, it doesn't mean that every interpretation is good. Some of them are going to just get far away. If you interpret it wrong, you deploy the wrong kinds of sort of instrumentalities of artistic expression, the wrong kinds of characters, the wrong kinds of plot development. If you deploy it the wrong way, you're not going to realize the value that the author was trying to realize. But sometimes you can deploy totally different ones and perfectly realize what the author was trying to realize. That's his view. It's a really interesting, I think, view of how this works. Lesme, you're asking, the interpretation fits the work. The idea is that the work is the value they're trying to realize. And so when we're interpreting, we're trying to interpret that value, not the particular social constructions they use to realize that value. Yeah. Okay. So there's only 20 minutes left, and we got some important differences here. So here's important other things to cover. Here's another really important thing. So we saw Hart in the previous book give us a kind of list of necessary and sufficient conditions, a theory of what the concept of law was. That's the name of his book, The Concept of Law. Now, and he thinks, like Hart thought, that's what philosophy of law is all about, like trying to get clear on what our concept of the law is. Dworkin doesn't think that's right. Here's a reason why he thinks this is wrong. He thinks it leads to this conception of what we're doing in philosophy of law as coming up with these necessary and sufficient conditions. And we come up with this concept, and then anybody who doesn't share that concept, therefore, isn't even talking about law. Can you guys see why that would be? Because, like, say I came up with a list of necessary and sufficient conditions for somebody being a bachelor. It's the classic example used in analytic philosophy. A bachelor is an unmarried man. So if I then start talking about a bachelor and I mean a different concept, so suppose I'm talking about somebody who's messy and doesn't do the dishes, or sleeps on on a mattress on the floor. And that's what I mean by bachelor. Well, if you mean unmarried man and I mean a guy that doesn't do the dishes, then when I make claims about what a bachelor is, and you make claims about what a bachelor is, we're not actually disagreeing with each other, right? Because I'm talking about one thing, you're talking about a totally different thing. We're making different claims, but neither of these claims actually conflict with each other. You might say bachelors are unreliable. Or I might say that, and you might say that's you can't say that in general. Like sometimes bachelors are reliable. But we were not talking about the same thing at all. And so there's no possibility of disagreement. So yeah, like Melissa's bringing up riverbank or financial institution. These are two different uses of the word bank. And if they have different concepts, they just happen to share the same name. Here's a question then, though. So Dworkin doesn't think that this is the right concept of what we're doing in law, in philosophy of law, or even in law itself. So what are we doing? How is it possible for us to have, for like a utilitarian and a libertarian, for example, to disagree about justice, about whether a progressive taxation system is just? How is it possible for them to actually disagree substantively, where they're not just talking past each other about different conceptions of justice? This is a really hard question, so I'd be impressed if anybody had a great answer to it.
Do you mind repeating it really quick?
Yeah, how is it possible for two people who appear to have different concepts of justice to disagree with each other? Niam?
In like the utilitarian and libertarian example, like the utilitarian would argue that like taxation is just because like it increases overall welfare.
Mm-hmm.
And like a libertarian would, on the other hand, say that it's unjust because it forces people to like give up their income that they earn, say. So like overall, like, I mean, it's the same concept of justice in a sense, but like they disagree on just like the interpretation of the concept.
Yeah, they
Like even if
disagree
it's
on
the
the
same,
interpretation.
like they're at the end of the day, like both can be true, but it's like the way that you perceive it, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the fact that they have different interpretations of justice is a really good point. And here Hart is not like just saying like a subjectivist would say that like, look, they have different concepts. Because in fact, this is a problem for subjectivism about any theory, that it's hard to make sense of how disagreement between two people is possible. Because if all I'm referring to when I say justice is just what's going on in my head, this is what I think justice is, then when I say justice is X, Y, and Z, and you respond by saying, no, justice is A, B, and C, we're not talking about the same things. I'm talking about X, Y, and Z. You're talking about A, B, and C. We're talking past each other. So what Dworkin is saying is these are different interpretations, but they're different interpretations of the same underlying value. They're different substantive interpretations of the same underlying value. This isn't a word game that both those sides are playing. They're arguing about something that is outside of us, independent of us, or at least independent of any one of us, and trying to identify what the right way of thinking about that thing is. Rather than coming up with like just a definition in their heads, they're trying to identify the actual features of the phenomenon, which is justice. And they have different interpretations of that. So they can argue because there is a shared object of their argument. It's something that does not inhere just in their own minds or in a list of conditions that they've come up with in their own minds. It's something that is that that is actually it's like present in our social relations in varying degrees, and we're arguing about those social relations. What we're not doing is just arguing about what's in each of our own heads, right? That's the idea. Yeah, I think you're getting like right onto it there. Yeah. Okay, so um okay, let's talk about another important point here. So I think so on Dworkin's view, legal disputes are competing interpretations of the law, right? Of what law is. It's like a bunch of complex facts about our social relations. Different people have different interpretations of those things. We're arguing about which interpretation is better. Well, we just spent a bunch of time talking about what interpretation is for Dworkin. He has this theory of constructive interpretation. It's not about what people's intentions were at the time. It's not about the specific social relations that people used as instrumentalities for realizing their goals. It's about what the goals were. And so people have different interpretations of those goals and different ways of realizing those goals. Okay? So one thing that Dworkin has to contend with here is the possibility that, as a lot of like literary critics might believe, and if you read like Derrida, for example, this Derrida is really big about this. I hate Derrida, by the way. But Derrida's view is like, look, everything is interpretation. And you can have different interpretations, but there's no one best interpretation of anything. And in fact, in some way, every interpretation is just as good as any other. There's no external perspective from which we can judge an interpretation, and therefore that there's no right way or wrong way of interpreting anything. He starts out with literary criticism, but he really applies it to virtually any social relation you could imagine. That's not the case for Dworkin. He doesn't think that any interpretation is as good as any other. He thinks, and this applies, by the way, in the context of law in particular. Like you have sometimes people that are like intense legal realists who think like the law just is what the law does. And the only thing that matters is what the judge actually ends up effectuating by the end of their opinion. What does it actually change about society? Dworkin doesn't think that's right, because he doesn't think that we can only assess the quality of an interpretation, like a judicial opinion, simply based on its effects. Instead, he thinks some interpretations carry with them the assertion that other interpretations are wrong. So some interpretations are just like, look, this is my interpretation. This is how I see it. You could see it a different way. But a lot of times what we're talking about when we say this is the law, what we're saying is not only that this interpretation is right, but that other ones are wrong. We make this claim sometimes. So when we're doing that, we're engaged in a kind of criticism of the law. We're skeptical of other interpretations. We're saying that those other interpretations don't get it right. There's two ways we can do this, according to Dworkin. So we can have internal skepticism, internal criticism, where we say, look, there is a particular way of interpreting this social practice which best realizes the values that matter, that are served by that social practice. And these other ways of doing that are bad or stupid. So it could be that what we're trying to do when we tip our caps is express respect for other people. But if the way we do that is only to people who are in the nobility, and we don't do it to people who are otherwise deserving, but who are commoners like the rest of us, well, we're not instantiating the value of respect for other people in the proper way. That interpretation, as given by that set of social relations, is inadequate. It doesn't realize the value that it's meant to realize in the most optimal way. This is an internal criticism, because what it means is you are taking for granted the value at stake here of respecting other people. And you are saying that the way we're trying to go about realizing that value is screwed up in some way. That's a particular kind of skepticism or criticism. And I think that's what Dworkin thinks we're usually doing when we're criticizing the law. If we are skeptical of a particular interpretation of law, it's because we think that there's a value that's really important here, and this interpretation fails to realize that value fully. So the framers of the 14th Amendment thought we're realizing the value of social equality by allowing segregation to continue as long as segregation is separate but equal. And that the value was social equality. The way that they chose to go about it was wrong because it didn't fully realize the value. And we can realize it through a different pattern of social relations. That's a kind of skepticism of a particular kind of interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Now, there's another kind of criticism that sometimes gets conflated with that kind of criticism, which Dworkin calls external criticism. This is the idea that the entire enterprise of interpretation is bankrupt and fraudulent and pointless. So I mentioned in the lecture, there were these guys called the logical positivists in the early 20th century. And they basically made this argument about all of morality, all of value theory in general, so aesthetics included. They basically said, anytime you say something is good or bad or just or unjust or beautiful or ugly, you couldn't possibly be expressing an opinion that a particular thing out in the world has these features. Instead, all you're really doing is expressing your feelings about these features or expressing a kind of commitment to a norm about these features, that I'm going to act this way, or this is how I feel. And if this view was correct, then a lot of the kind of like criticism from within a system of normative values that says, look, we're failing to realize social equality by allowing segregation. If you take an external skeptic view, you would say, there's no such thing as social equality. Like that term doesn't refer to anything that we can actually test, that we can actually identify, that we can measure. And so it's just like talking about witches. Nobody thinks witches exist. It's a kind of category that doesn't actually match up with the world in any way. They're not real. Well, if social equality isn't real, then the very value that is supposed to be instantiated by the 14th Amendment isn't real. And the whole enterprise, not only of advocating a particular view of it like they did in the 19th century, but also advocating a particular view of it like we had with Brown versus Board of Education, that whole enterprise is pointless. Does anybody know what Dworkin's response to this is? How do you respond to somebody who says, there's no such thing as social equality? Who's just a kind of generalized skeptic about it, a kind of nihilist. This isn't even real. You're making stuff up. How does Dworkin respond to that? Spinning the wheel. Let's see, is Sergio here? Yes. Sergio, what do you think? How does Dworkin respond to this idea that like that maybe like a very basic value like social equality isn't even real?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the full question again? I missed part of it.
So like, how does he respond to this criticism that like, look, you have all these interpretations of what is social equality. Like you say that your interpretation's better than the people who came before you. But like, this whole thing, everybody's interpretation is wrong because there's no such thing. It's not even real. These values you're talking about, I can't see them. We can't test them. They're not scientific.
Well,
they're not even real.
That would be the external skepticism that Dworkin mentioned that he refutes because it's very nihilistic, and instead of taking like a concept per se as a whole and trying to look at like maybe the purpose of the concept or like the nuances within it, it kind of just ignores all of that and deigns to say that, you know, make a very broad assumption based on just the concept itself without looking at any nuance. And, for instance, like the fact that social equality is a lot deeper than saying it doesn't exist or it's too conceptual.
Okay. Well, we got to be careful, though, not to beg the question against the external skeptic, because if all we're saying is, look, this is a valuable concept, you're ignoring this really valuable concept, then what they will say is, you're just begging the question. You're saying it's valuable. I'm saying it's not valuable. You can't say, look, this is very valuable, and so you shouldn't ignore it. I'll just say it's not. Right?
Right. Well, I guess what I mean to say is then to even evaluate something like that, to even make the assumption that it's, valuable or invaluable, you have to at least give it the respect of looking at it as a whole, to kind of delve into the parts of it so that you can make any kind of assumption about it rather than just dismissing it.
So I think that's a good point. I don't think it's quite what Dworkin is saying, but I actually like that point in the sense that, like, there is something important going on with this whole area of social relations. And if it turns out it's all made up, that'd be kind of surprising. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes we do have made up concepts like witches that don't actually apply to anything in reality. But a lot of our society is organized around these concepts. It'd be really surprising if all of them were wrong. Like if they were just not even real.
It would be upsetting. It
Yeah.
would be scary.
Yeah. I mean, I think they do these cases do exist sometimes, but I don't think it applies to all normative concepts. Yeah. Okay. I want to make sure we're clear though on exactly what Dworkin says. So Trina, did you have an idea?
Yeah, I actually wanted to add on to the idea of external skepticism. I think you'd say this is an example of external skepticism. If ideally, this kind of like skepticism fails because no theoretical values are not discovered like scientific facts, but they're still meaningful within the practice of reasoning. When people debate social equality, they're engaging interpretation.
Oh,
But what
hold on.
doesn't surprise?
I'm not quite here. You're a bit muffled. Maybe you're too close to the mic.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I think I'm wearing my AirPods. That's why. Okay.
Oh,
Let me
okay.
try to adjust them. Okay. So basically, I would also like to add on that to like the previous person who was speaking, that you would claim that this is an example of external skepticism, because when like people debate social equality, they are engaging in interpretation about what justice requires. And then the fact that people disagree does not mean that the value itself is meaningless. So I would say that he deems it as like external skepticism, since external skepticism rejects the entire practice of interpretation by arguing that values like social equality don't really exist or have no real meaning. Like,
Okay. So like, I got most of that. Let me add to it.
yeah.
So he thinks, look, there might be some people who have this view, but those people go around saying things are lawful or right or wrong. Oh, sorry,
I don't
Trina,
want
you're
anything.
still,
I don't know why we're here.
Trina, your mic is still open.
I'm so sorry.
Okay. This is the last point, and then I'll let everybody go. He says that these people go around making these claims about things being lawful or unlawful. They make claims about things being valuable or disvaluable, right or wrong. And then they will go on in there, they'll put their philosopher cap on and then say, actually, none of those things actually exist. But if they don't exist, you're really committed to the idea that they don't have any impact on you, that like none of them matter. Because if there's no value, if value is not real, then nothing like this matters. So you shouldn't go around saying that things are valuable or disvaluable. Like, it's a kind of contradiction. It's a kind of practical contradiction. And basically nobody lives their life from the position of an external skeptic. They adopt it for the purposes of these specialized philosophical arguments. And then they go around deciding, oh, I'm not going to park here because I'll get a parking ticket and that's illegal. Right. They're using these concepts all the time as though they have meaning, even though these concepts, according to them, don't. And that's just, he thinks, a basic kind of inconsistency. Okay, I might want to expand on that next time, but let's go ahead and conclude there. Thank you for the great discussion, guys, and I will see you guys next week to discuss more Dworkin.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.